So I want to talk about archetypes today. We've spoken about that before. And, archetypes are a way of classifying behavior that you can see across different stories from different personalities, right? So you have like the warrior's archetype you see often in the movie 300 or Braveheart. You have the hero's journey that's reflected in Batman and Superman, Lord of the Rings, where you have to go through these great transformations. And then you have different archetypes or different personalities in the midst of those stories, whether it's a king, the warrior, the magician, the son. Today I want to focus on the jester, because Elijah, the prophet Elijah, he reminds me of the jester type of archetype, and also what the jester might mean for us, especially in our times. And this has nothing to do with the fact that I watched Deadpool and Wolverine twice in theaters already. Deadpool is the Marvel jester. Perfect. The jester archetype, he's like the clown, right? So he's the one that's always the comedian, the fool. He's always, his great tool is humor, that he's always using, and his humor has an end. His humor is to speak the truth that nobody else can say. So historically, every king's court had a jester in it. And the jester, the one rule was he could say whatever he wanted without repercussion. Because everybody else in the king's court is afraid of being punished. But the jester, the king's jester, he can speak the hard truths that nobody else wants to say and do it in a funny way, and everyone just kind of laughs him off as the clown. What's interesting is that the first sign of tyranny that we see always in stories is whenever the king silences the jester. Because what that means is that in this court, truth cannot be heard anymore. The king will not allow any opposition to his opinion. So once the jester is quieted or even put to death, that's the sign that the king is going towards tyranny. So Hitler knew this very well. Hitler shut down every comedy club throughout Germany in his times. It was a death sentence to ever criticize anything that Stalin did. You know, if you ever spoken or found any parishioner who's spoken ill of me, you couldn't find them. They're not here anymore. This is what tyrants do, all right? They can't take criticism, right? So in our times, though, the jesters, I think, of our times are the comedians. Comedy was never something, stand-up comedy, that I was ever really into. But it was like 3 years ago that I watched with a group of guys, Bill Burr's, which I'm not recommending, Bill Burr's stand-up. And I was really shocked because he was saying things that, number one, not a lot of even priests or bishops are calling out about the hypocrisy of our culture and of politics and of gender roles and feminism and what have you. All these hot button issues they're calling out in a way that no one else is doing. And number two, people are listening. And the fact that people are listening is because humor, there's a power that opens us up to truth in the midst of it. That's the jester. That's the power of that gift. But recently, comedians have said that they refuse to go on college campuses anymore because that it's deemed hate speech. And that's why the concept of actually punishing people for humor or for free speech in any way starts to border on the lines of tyranny, because you're no longer able to speak the truth. But I think one of the great prophet Elijah, in a way in the Old Testament, he reflected the jester of that time, because he was in the king's court with all these other prophets. And the prophet's job is to call out the people of Israel, to call out the king and bring them back to truth when they go away. And in his time, there's 851 prophets. And it says that all 850 prophets stopped speaking the truth to the king, King Ahab and Jezreel, his wife. Because why? They would be put to death. And so they started just telling them what they wanted to hear, and little by little Israel started to worship the false gods of those peoples, and no longer the true God of Israel. And Elijah, he had kind of he had a way of mocking, when he wanted to get a point across. And, we just found him in this first reading where he's on the outskirts in the middle of a desert, longing at this point for death because Jezreel and Ahab are trying to kill him. Well, it's because right before this scene was that great moment on Mount Carmel when the 850 prophets of Baal all stood up against Elijah the prophet, the one man who was willing to speak the truth to the king and queen and call them back to the worship and the commandments of God. And they had this little deity dance-off where they had this fire, this big holocaust, and they had to call down fire each side. And so as the other side, the 850 prophets now of Baal, of the false god, are calling are calling for the deity, Elijah's there, trolling them in a sense. It says, at noon Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. And nothing happens. And just to taunt them even more, Elijah has them dump 3 barrels of water over the holocaust. And finally, at one word, calls down, asks the Lord to send down fire, comes down, consumes the holocaust. And right then, he proves to all the people that God is, the God of Israel, is the one true God. He might have went a step too far and he killed every single one of those prophets right there on the mountain. And he had definitely a runner's high at that moment. But in a sense, the Jezreel and King Ahab got so angry that they said, if you're not dead by tomorrow, may the same thing happen to us. And so now he's fleeing. He's on the run and he's all by himself on the outskirts of Israel. So he was exiled for speaking the truth and calling the people back to conversion. And in a sense, I really think that's an image that not only was he the only one speaking the truth and standing up against evil and the lies, but he did it with humor. And he did it with a good sense of hope and trust in God. And to be honest, that's actually why I do really like Deadpool. It's kind of inappropriate, and I'm not recommending that we all watch it, but Deadpool is the jester of Marvel, right? And his thing is he never takes anything serious in life, right? Which is a good and a bad thing, but he's in the fight, he's suffering, he's trying to do the right thing, but he never loses his sense of humor. And I think it's perfect, especially for our times, because when he's set against Wolverine's the archetype of the warrior, the man who gets so caught up in battle and trying to win the fight that he actually begins to lose his soul, to lose who he is. And that's the dark side of the warrior. So they take the fallen side of the one who's in the fight and sets it alongside the one guy who doesn't take anything serious. And it's a great kind of company that they have together. What does this mean for all of us? I think anyone who is striving to be faithful to God in these times, like the prophet Elijah, like the apostles, like the saints of old, we're already in the fight. To be faithful to Jesus Christ in our life in the midst of a culture that is increasingly rejecting Jesus and his teachings, you have to be a warrior to keep your faith. It's never going to be on autopilot. But with that fight comes a great danger. And I've seen it in myself, and I've seen it in other Catholics around me, is that we can lose our joy and our laughter in the midst of war. It's like, become Catholic. It sucks. It's really depressing. Like, no one wants that, right? People want to be inspired to say that to follow Jesus Christ, there's a whole new level of joy and love and life and peace that you can get when you follow him. But our temptation is that we get so obsessed that it's on us, that we have to fight the battle, that we have to make it work, that we close ourselves off to all the beauty and the joy that God is offering us around us. There's a saying, it's one of my favorite Latin sayings, risus et bellum, or you can say risus et bellum, and it means laughter and warfare. Or another translation, laughter is warfare. Because humor is a way of separating ourselves from all the things that are so difficult in our life that we can look at it, but we can still laugh at it. Right? And can humor go too far? Can we push it too much? Yes, absolutely. And don't even get me started on the Jehovah's Witnesses. It can go too far. But I'd rather go too far with humor than go too far with war. Because war, to get caught in the mindset that life is all a war and up to me, that's a sign of pride. It's very hard for God to find us in pride because it closes us off to His work and makes us feel as if it's all up to me to make life work. G.K. Chesterton has a great quote. He says, "Kings in their heavy gold and the proud in their robes of purple will all of their nature sink downwards. For pride cannot rise to levity or levitation. Pride is the downward drag of all things into an easy solemnity. One settles down into a sort of selfish seriousness. But one has to put an effort to rise to a happy self-forgetfulness. It is really a natural trend or lapse into taking oneself gravely because it's actually the easiest thing to do, to take ourselves and life too serious. For solemnity flows out of men naturally, but laughter is a leap. It is easy to be heavy. It is very hard to be light. It takes effort to hope, to be faithful, to have faith, to be joy, to have joy in the midst of war. But I think most of all, the reason I think it's so important is it shows God that we trust Him. When we can laugh and rejoice, even in the midst of suffering, never burying our head in the sand, not running away from battle or pretending that things aren't pretty bad, but when you can look at it with a smile and even with a little laughter in the midst of it, it shows God that you trust Him, that you believe that He's stronger than everything else around you and within you. That's the deepest sign of trust. And we as Christians should be able to live that kind of life more than anybody else in this world if we actually believe that in the end Christ has already conquered and that He can take care of every one of our problems according to His time and way. It's His battle, and we're just here to call down the fire and mock our enemies along the way. That's it. So I'll end with one more quote that summarizes everything. So let us fight, but let our motto be risus et bellum, laughter and warfare, because nothing stings our foes, foreign and domestic, more than our hearty laughter at their lies and nonsense. And also, because nothing will better remind us what we're fighting for than the laughter of Chesterton, of Chaucer, and of Shakespeare, and of course, the God who inspired them all. Risus et bellum.